Bayfield, Maine, had always been a place where the sounds of the nighttime wind through the woods and the soft rustling of leaves on the roads created a sense of calm. But now it had become synonymous with horror. Suddenly, without warning, it had become the center of a dark nightmare, where every step felt like a harbinger of even greater misfortune. Lindsay Braid, a 33-year-old nurse who had spent decades helping people, could no longer help anyone. Her body was found in an abandoned garage, once a place full of human activity, now an ideal setting for hidden horrors. The terrifying smell of blood filled the air, and the dark shadows on the walls seemed alive, as if every inch of the place absorbed pain. Lindsay lay wrapped in cold steel wires, which, like snakes, had burrowed into her skin and muscles. The wires sliced through her flesh with incredible force, leaving strange, claw-like marks on her body, as if something had attacked her in the dark. Lindsay's severed fingers, which once gently touched patients and supported them through their darkest moments, now lay nearby, glistening on the dark concrete. The blood seeping from her wounds had begun to coagulate, forming crimson stains that, along with her body, created a terrifying portrait of suffering. Her eyes, still open even in death, radiated an unimaginable fear, and her final gaze seemed frozen at the heart of this horrible place. Her face, still bearing the echoes of despair, had now become cold and merciless. But what struck Detective Jack Rayner was not just the barbaric brutality of the murder, but the mark left by the killer. On the wall, in all its ruthless beauty, was the number 1 painted in Lindsay's blood. This horrifying inscription seemed deliberate and undeniably significant. It wasn't a random act. It felt like this was just the first step in something bigger, more complex, and far deadlier. 3 days later, another body was found in the woods. William Richards, the elderly man, who had spent his life supporting the local community and helping those in need, now lay torn apart in a bizarre, brutal fashion. His throat had been ripped open with such precision that it seemed as though the killer was working with the professionalism of a surgeon. His eyes were closed, and his face wore the expression of hopelessness. Beside him lay a piece of fabric with the number 2 cut out. A clue, yet another step in this nightmare. William Richards's body was abandoned at the edge of the woods, and although it was found among the trees, there was nothing natural about its gruesome appearance. It seemed as though the forest had swallowed every scream, every movement, and now it had become part of this horrific trap. Detective Rayner, lost in his thoughts, began to feel that these weren't random murders. Everything seemed too much like part of a grand, calculated plan. The numbers 1 and 2 had become clear signals to him, but their meaning remained cloaked in darkness. Despite the ongoing investigation, it seemed that every new step only deepened the mystery. No obvious connections between the victims, no common traits, only death, terror, and cryptic numbers. Rayner felt that each of them was just a fragment of something larger, more dangerous. Like the 2 numbers left on the walls, their sequence promised more than just a horrifying beginning. Detective Jack Rayner sat in his office, flipping through the papers that had been brought to him that morning. The calm, uneventful day was suddenly interrupted when an unfamiliar letter appeared on his desk. It had no seal, no address. The letter was folded roughly, with smudges of dirt on it, as if it had recently been thrown to the ground. Rayner unfolded it and immediately saw that it had been cut out from old newspapers. The first paragraph was clear, with large letters cut from headlines. Fire at the orphanage. Dozens of children dead. Cause negligence by the administration. Rayner felt his heart tighten. The fire had been one of the biggest tragedies in Bayfield, but he had never suspected that it hid such dark, undisclosed secrets. He read on carefully. Time is running out. All those responsible will be punished. 3 short lines that seemed to carry no new information, but deep down, Rayner felt that this was a challenge he couldn't ignore. There was something wrong with the letter, even sinister. He had a sense that this letter was yet another clue that the recent brutal murders weren't just a random series of crimes, but part of a deep, long-hidden plan. He began reviewing the cases again. Lindsay Braid, the nurse who had been the first victim, worked at that very orphanage. William Richards, the man whose body had been found on the edge of the woods, was a firefighter who had shown negligence on that fateful night, leading to the deaths of 5 children when he refused to go into the west wing of the shelter. And now, these murders that had seemed random were increasingly showing a connection. It was clear now that these deaths weren't just acts of vengeance, they were something more. This was a personal reckoning, and each victim was part of a chain that led to one horrific tragedy. But then, just as Rainer was trying to piece together this terrifying puzzle, another horrible event occurred. This time, the victim was a young woman who had once led the orphanage's charity foundation. She was well known in the town, frequently seen at various events where she raised funds for the orphanage. Many people even saw her as a hero who had pulled the shelter out of financial ruin and helped many children find their homes. Now, her name was forever tied to tragedy, and her death had become part of this horrifying plan. Her body was found in her own home. The room was dark, with only the faint light from the window casting long shadows on the floor. She was chained to a chair, her arms and legs tightly bound with chains driven into the old wood. The chair was clearly old, its thick screws sinking through the metal rings that held the victim. Her face was the very picture of absolute horror. Her eyes were wide, stretched from pain, and her lips twisted as if she had tried to say something but couldn't. In the hour that had passed, her body had already begun to cool with the heavy grip of death. But death wasn't the worst thing in the room. The most horrifying part was the number 3 precisely carved into her chest. The same dreadful message left after each murder, burned into her skin, still glowing faintly in the dim light. The number reminded Rainer that all of these killings were no coincidence, and they were part of something much darker, something far more terrifying. The air was thick with fear and a sense of helplessness. In every corner of the room, there were remnants of the horrors of the past: old furniture, an ashtray with half-burnt cigarettes, a crumpled newspaper with the headline "Fire at the Orphanage." Everything pointed to this woman being connected to that fateful night. Jack Rainer felt the dark abyss he was trying to uncover grow deeper. He didn't know who would be next, but he knew there was only one way forward, into this labyrinth of horror, until he unraveled all the secrets that had engulfed the town. The 4th victim, Irene Smith, the orphanage caregiver, was found in her own apartment, but her death marked a higher degree of cruelty compared to the previous murders. This wasn't just a death, it was a ritual, and she had become its centerpiece. Irene lay on her bed, but not in a typical position. Her hands were tightly bound to the bed, and her legs were secured as well, as if she couldn't move even an inch. There was no sign of struggle or protest on her face, only the shadows of mortal fear. And here was the most horrifying detail. Irene's tongue had been cut out, a simple yet striking act, rendering her silent, incapable of even crying out in pain or conveying a message. Her eyes, deeply sunken, seemed to stare into the darkness of the room, silently asking, "Why?" Her posture was strange, as if she had tried to rise but was powerless to move, forever fixed in place, like a part of a trap. The most terrifying thing that Detective Rainer saw was on the wall. Not just a drawing, not simply a graphic, a number 4 was carved into the tile, but not with an ordinary knife. It was done with a special tool, almost like intricate wood carving, as if symbolizing some grand message. The lines were straight, precise, but deep, like wounds that couldn't heal. And that number stood there, a silent witness to the new stage of the horrific game the killer had started many years ago. But what Rainer couldn't understand was that, unlike the previous victims, Irene showed no obvious signs of struggle or even an attempt to escape. She was fixed in place like a part of the nightmarish mechanism that was going deeper. And the death itself was slow, without any chance for salvation, without the ability to scream or even offer any repentance. Each new crime was another step on the path to something greater, darker, and more brutal, where every number, every action had meaning. But what became the most unexpected was the disappearance of reporter Emma Lane. She had been there, always in the know, and suddenly vanished as mysteriously as all the previous victims. Rainer, who was increasingly feeling that she might be part of this terrible plan, headed to her apartment. But when he entered her place, he found only emptiness. And on the wall, next to the door, was the number 5. This was more than just a subconscious connection. It meant that the killer and she were part of this dark circle. Something had changed. What did the number 5 mean to the killer? And why had he left this message on the wall instead of through another death? The answer seemed closer than ever, yet at the same time even more tangled. Again, those questions, the quality that gave Rainer the sense that the killer was no longer just playing his game. This whole story had already been decided. Now, it was just a matter of putting the puzzle pieces together. The guard, Jonathan Griffin, was found on his day off at one of the abandoned warehouses used to store old equipment. His body, grotesquely mutilated, sparked a deep sense of unease in Detective Rainer. It seemed Jonathan had played an important role in these murders, even if he hadn't been directly involved. The guard's body was drained of life and left on the central workbench. His eyes were wide open, but his gaze was empty, as if life had been drained from him long before death came. The number 6 had been carved into his face, but this wasn't just a mark. It seemed to be part of a larger, terrifying code. But the worst details emerged when Rainer examined the walls of the warehouse. There were inscriptions, etched in blood, old and new numbers that continued to appear like clues. The number 6 was part of a series that included the first 5 murders. It was clear that the killer was creating something far greater, a story. This was no simple act of revenge, but a cipher reconstructing tragedy through the mosaic of victims. The most terrifying discovery came when Rainer found a diary hidden under Jonathan's body. It belonged to an orphanage survivor who had lived through the horrific fire. Rainer flipped through the first few pages, and a chilling truth unfolded before him. March 2nd, 1997, abandoned orphanage, night. We made it out of the burning building, but for me, it wasn't just a step toward freedom. It was my revenge. Emma and I, we both witnessed how everything went wrong. The fire that took so many lives didn't just steal our friends, our brothers and sisters, it also took my soul. We were left alone with it, scars not only on our bodies but on our hearts. I remember how we hid when the fire started, how we tried to escape this hell. We lost everyone, but that's not all. They left us, all of them, those bastards who let the children die, who closed their eyes and abandoned us. There wasn't a single chance for salvation, and they will pay for this. They will all pay. Everyone who was in that building and didn't save us. They will pay until they die just like we did. They don't suspect that I know everything now. The final stage, the last jagged piece of revenge. The last person left among them. You'll be surprised who it is, but for me, it's not just a person. It's a symbol of everything we went through. You think it will end when we destroy them, but it won't. It's just beginning. You'll find out who this person is. And in that moment, you'll understand why we had to do this. At 11 p.m., the abandoned hospital. This will be our final game. Reading these words felt like a blow to the chest. Rainer realized the killer wasn't just one person. This story was much darker. It wasn't just revenge for him, but for his sister, who had remained in the shadows. All the clues pointed to the hospital, the decaying building on the outskirts of the city. The details were clear. The last victim would be there, but that wasn't all. Despite having all the details now, Rainer was left with one crucial question. Who was this person? His heart raced faster as he prepared to uncover the terrifying truth that would complete this horrific path of vengeance. The hospital, forgotten and abandoned, wasn't just a place that hid the memories of the fire. It had become the place where revenge could come to its most horrifying and chilling end. Rainer couldn't afford to miss this opportunity, because now he understood this case was more than just an investigation. It was a battle with hell itself. Rainer pulled his jacket tighter around him, feeling the cold seep through the fabric. This place, these words, everything pointed to this being the end. The final act. But he didn't know what he was stepping into, what the final play would be, who the last victim would be, or who would once again manipulate him like a pawn on a chessboard. His restless thoughts wouldn't settle, but he knew now wasn't the time for fear. To understand it all, he had to get to the hospital. He glanced at his watch, only a few minutes left. Even before he started heading toward the abandoned house, a question had already formed in his mind. What if he didn't make it? The car sped through empty streets, most people likely unaware that something deadly important was about to unfold at the abandoned hospital that night. He noticed how the headlights cut through the fog, lighting up the way. Streets he hadn't noticed before seemed unnervingly unnatural. He checked his phone's map again, but in the darkness, any signal could vanish in minutes. The abandoned hospital appeared around the corner, dark and silent. It stood like a monolith in an empty place, its presence seeming like it would swallow anyone who dared enter. Rainer held his breath, suppressing the emotions rising inside him. This moment felt like the turning point. He stopped the car at the entrance, turned off the engine, and stepped into the night's chill. As his feet hit the ground, he felt the dampness seep into his shoes, but he didn't stop. His footsteps echoed in the silence. The hospital was dark, its 4 floors towering before him like silent witnesses to the past. The doors were locked, but Rainer found an open window on the first floor. He climbed inside. The air inside the building was cold and foul, filled with the stench of rot and old blankets. The place was dead, yet alive at the same time. Rainer felt his skin tighten as he walked through the dark hallways. Every sound, the crunch of glass beneath his feet, the soft scraping of doors, made him clench his fists and push forward. Recalling the journal entry, Rainer made his way toward the basement. He shoved the door to the old hospital basement open, and there stood Emma, cold smile on her face, and Jared, holding a knife soaked in blood. Laura, Rainer's wife, sat tied to a chair, her face tear-streaked, eyes filled with despair and shock. Emma spoke softly. "All these murders, all this horror, it's not just for fun. It's retribution for those children. Your wife is guilty too, Rainer. She didn't just leave the kids to die. She ignored the call that day, thinking it was a joke. And now you'll pay for it." Rainer couldn't believe his ears. Laura, his Laura, was responsible for the children's deaths? She ignored the call at the worst moment? He couldn't believe it. He had always thought she was a good, just person, and now this reality hit him. She couldn't help them. She couldn't save them. Anger filled his soul. He moved toward her, trying to free her, but Jared lunged at him. A knife strike. Rainer only defended himself, trying to block the next blow. Watching this, Emma's expression didn't change. She only smiled. "You want to save your wife? But you have no future." The fight grew more brutal. Rainer fought back, knocking the knife from Jared's hand. Darkness enveloped the room, with only faint light from the overhead lamps casting a dim glow. Rainer lunged at Jared, who desperately grabbed anything around him to protect himself. In a moment, Rainer knocked him off balance, and Jared fell to the floor, his head hitting the concrete. The sounds of the bloody struggle now only ripped through the silence. But it wasn't over. Emma, watching it all with a cold expression, suddenly stepped out of the shadows. She moved toward Laura, yanking her head back, and slit her throat with the knife. Blood began to pour, soaking her pale fingers. Laura didn't have the strength to protest. Only the bitter refusal was visible on her face. She died, her body convulsing, but the final moments of her life were shrouded in darkness. Rainer, utterly powerless and lost in an endless void, saw his last horror, Laura, his love, dying right in front of him. He screamed in pain and threw himself at Emma, trying to uncover her face, shouting that it was his mistake, his fault. He understood now that he couldn't stop the disaster. And, on the brink of death, he tried to break free from her deadly embrace. But his body no longer obeyed him. The struggle between him and Emma became the final battle, as he tried to seize the last moments of life. Emma pulled him back, slicing into his chest with the knife, and in one moment, Rainer collapsed to the floor, losing consciousness. He lay dead, his body distorted by brutal blows, his eyes frozen in a final gaze that couldn't comprehend the full horror of what had just happened. Laura, dead, surrounded by an eerie silence that enveloped her lifeless body. On the wall, in red blood, Emma wrote the number 7. It was their final mark, their last message. They had finally gotten their revenge. The room filled with a silence more terrifying than any scream. Emma left the basement, leaving behind bloodstains on the walls and floor as a grim testament to what they had been through. Her brother, Jared, was also dead, but she had avenged them both. After all that had happened, death seemed to have settled here forever, and revenge had calmed her soul. Subscribe, and leave a comment on whether you believe that revenge could be the only path to justice. And remember, sometimes the cost of revenge is not just a life, but a soul that will remain tainted forever.